Welcome to the Workflow Podcast. If you enjoy this show, please like, share, and or subscribe. And now, on with the show. Welcome back to the Workflow Podcast for Season 3, Episode 2. And today we're going to talk all about, for the next few episodes, we're going to talk all about the myriad ways we go about sabotaging our ability to get into flow, to do deep work, to get into the zone as individuals. So these are the things we do to essentially get in the way of our best work and ultimately leave us feeling like crap come the end of the day. And for those of you on the YouTube, yes, I have a beanie on. It's a cold, wintry morning here in Melbourne, and for whatever reason, I've decided not to put the heater on because I find having the heater on all day just makes me feel kind of not great for whatever reason. I'd rather just rug up than have the heat running all day, as strange as that may sound. But let's get into today's session. So today, I wanted to introduce you to an acronym called TIRES. So what does TIRES actually stand for? Well, these are the tires that are effectively slowing us down when it comes to our productivity, when it comes to getting shit done. Now, T stands for task switching. Y stands for saying yes. R stands for residual work. E stands for taking the path of least effort. And S stands for shallow level work. Think email, think Slack, think Zoom calls that don't need to happen, think checking LinkedIn and Twitter. Now, all of these things combined can keep us busy all day long, but with little to show for all that busyness come the end of the day, come the end of the week, come the end of the month. So over the next few episodes, I'm going to deep dive into every single one of these. And today we're going to talk about task switching. So in the first episode, I introduced flow. And I introduced a study from McKinsey that found we are up to 5 times more productive when we're in the flow state. But we spend very little time in the flow state. In fact, the average person spends about 25 to 30 hours a week in meetings. Now, if your rostered hours, if we want to use that somewhat draconian term, is 40 hours a week, well, people are basically spending 3/4 of their time in meetings. Which is already sapping most of our ability to get into flow. But not only that, people are spending 3 hours a day in their inbox. People are checking their inbox once every 6 minutes on average. Now, this is from some work done or a study performed by Rescue Time, which is a screen tracking platform. So if you're spending 3 hours a day in your email, if you're spending 25 to 30 hours a week in meetings, and if you're switching screens every 20 seconds. Now, Stanford performed some research recently, published some research recently, which found people on average switch screens once every 20 seconds. That's insane. Then you are likely not spending any time in flow. And I haven't even touched on the fact that people touch their smartphones over 2,000 times a day, according to D-Scout, spend between 4 and 5 hours a day on average staring at their smartphones, which is 8 to 10 hours a week, and send several hundred messages a week through Slack or Microsoft Teams. All of this stuff combines to make us feel busy, and all of this stuff combines to have us getting nothing of value done. So the thing about task switching that I want you to really remember is this. If, for whatever reason, you cultivated the ability to get into the flow state, you found yourself, despite all of these distractions at your disposal these days, whether they are external distractions, such as a notification popping up on your screen or on your phone screen, or whether they are internal distractions where you're just feeling uncomfortable for whatever reason with what you're working on and you want to check Twitter because that's easier. Well, that's going to take you out of flow. But not only that, Gloria Mark, who has done a wealth of research in this space, found that it takes us on average 23 minutes to get back into flow after we switch tasks, because the brain essentially needs to orient around new information, a new context. Now, even if that context is somewhat similar to the work you're already doing, so for example, if I'm writing a report on CO2 emissions at my company, and then I go off onto a website looking for some information related to that, that can still incur a cognitive switching penalty, and that can still take me out of flow, and it can still cause me to spend 10, 15, 20, up to 23 minutes getting back into the zone. Now, if I'm switching all day long, well, clearly I'm not going to be spending any time in flow, because if I'm checking my email once every 6 minutes and it takes me on average 23 minutes to get back into flow, well, guess what? I ain't going to be spending any time doing my best work. I'm going to be in shallow work all day, and I'm going to feel like crap come the end of the day. Here's the other thing you might want to think about, or the other thing that I want to stress, is micro switches. Micro switches. So if a notification pops up on my screen, if a notification pops up on my smartphone, whatever the case is, and I don't click on that notification, I just notice it. My eye kind of shifts its attention. Oh yeah, I've got a notification. I'll look at that later. Now, it turns out that even if I don't click on it, that is enough to take me out of flow. And in fact, many micro switches over the course of the day has been shown to reduce our productivity by about 40%. Because when your mind is immersed on a task, but it sees a notification, suddenly its focus is now divided. And it can actually take a bit of time to get back to what it was you were doing. So if there is one thing that you can do to cultivate the ability to do more great work, it is really just cutting down on task switching. Now, when it comes to triggers, so I've had Nia Eyal on the Future Squared podcast in the past, and he is the author of Hooked and Indistractable, and he coined the term internal triggers and external triggers. And internal triggers are essentially those things inside us that force us to want to switch tasks, such as, oh, I'm feeling a bit of discomfort right now with this activity. Oh, I'm feeling a little bit lonely. Let's check Facebook Messenger and message my friends. Oh, I'm feeling this. Oh, I'm feeling that. Now, it turns out 90% of the time when we switch tasks, when we check our phones, it is because of these internal triggers. So I want you to remember the internal triggers. Now, the other side of that coin is the external triggers, which is the notifications popping up on the screen, which is the emails coming in, which is something outside of us forcing us to notice and take action. Now, we need to address these two separately. Now, the first one that we want to be looking at is the internal triggers. Now, when it comes to internal triggers, in the previous episode, I mentioned that embracing boredom is one way to counteract that. So, in order to get on top of those internal triggers that force us to switch screens, one, embrace boredom. If you're bored right now, hopefully I'm not boring you too much, or if you're bored later today, just sit there for 10 to 15 minutes and don't do anything and just wrestle with that discomfort without reaching for your phone, without reaching for a book, without going off and having to, without going for a walk, whatever it is. Just be in the moment. And as I said in the previous episode, the same thing goes when at a traffic light, when waiting in line at the grocery store, whatever it is, try to avoid the temptation to reach for your phone, because every time you do that, you're training your brain to essentially not be comfortable doing one thing and just being in the moment. You're training it to constantly seek out those tiny micro dopamine hits every few minutes. And if it's not getting that hit while you're at your desk, well, then it's going to tell you, hey man, let's switch screens, let's check what's going on Twitter, let's check Instagram, let's scroll mindlessly for a while. That's going to make us feel better. I believe it was Wait But Why, where And the author's name of Wait But Why totally escapes me for a second. I'm going to have to look that up because it's going to drive me crazy. And I should know this. I typically remember his name. I believe it was Tim Urban. That's right. So Tim Urban likes to call this the instant gratification monkey, forcing us to do something else because we're feeling a little bit uncomfortable right now. Now, the other thing you might want to do to help allay yourself of these internal triggers and get better at, essentially being the king of your mind or the queen of your mind is to just do one thing at a time. So if I'm sitting on the couch reading a book, well, let's just read a book. Let's read an entire chapter cover to cover without turning the TV on, without checking our phone, without getting up to do something else. If I'm watching a film, let's watch the whole film from the first minute all the way through to the last minute of that film. I don't want to check my phone. Let's just focus on the film. Same goes with absolutely everything. Just do one thing at a time, or at least try to cultivate the ability and spend more time doing one thing at a time. And that's going to transfer over into how you show up at your desk. Now, there are other things you can do. Meditation, even for 5 to 10 minutes a day, is going to allay you of all that stuff that's on your mind, at least to some degree, which means that while you're at your desk, those internal triggers saying, I don't feel good right now, I feel uncomfortable, I feel anxious, those triggers won't be as intense, won't be as loud, which will enable you to sit there and actually do more great work and not switch screens. Breathing, if you have an elevated heart rate and for whatever reason you're feeling a little bit anxious, breathing can go a long way. The physiological sigh, which I may have touched on in season 2, is all about breathing in a little bit more. It's a double inhale and then breathing out, a long exhale. Now, what that's actually going to do, according to Matt Huberman at the Stanford Performance Lab, I believe, where essentially the neuroscience lab, it's going to lower your heart rate and tap the parasympathetic nervous system and effectively put you in a much calmer state. So you can practice that, but at the same time, it doesn't necessarily need to be the physiological side, but it just can be deep breathing. That's going to calm you down so that you can focus on the task at hand, and whatever anxiety or elevated heart rate or tension you're bringing to the table, hopefully you can, as a result of this deep breathing and this physiological sigh, allay yourself of that and empower yourself to focus on the task at hand. Similarly, journaling, whatever's on your mind, writing it down or speaking out loud can get that out of your head and out into the world. One thing I've been experimenting with lately is creating some sense of separation between myself and whatever I'm feeling, simply by labeling those feelings as Misters. So, hi, Mr. Sadness. Hi, Mr. Fear. Hi, Mr. Anxiety. And just having like a 2-minute conversation with them, as crazy as that might sound. And one thing that does is it kind of embraces the feeling, because typically as human beings what we do is we try and escape feelings, we try and suppress feelings, but by having that conversation with that feeling, by checking in with that feeling, you're actually letting it just kind of come out and you're acknowledging it. The second thing that does is it creates separation between the so-called I and that feeling. And when you do that, you're not identifying with that feeling anymore. You're seeing it as a part of you that is separate to you in some respect. So journaling really helps to allay the mind so you can get into flow. And finally, just noticing. Every time you find yourself at your desk and you're struggling to focus, well, why is that? Did something happen? Were there any events that you can recall that prevent you or make it harder for you to get into flow? And can you get rid of those events, or can you ensure that those events don't happen again in the future? Was it an argument you had with your spouse? Well, perhaps you should try and reconcile so that you can focus on the task at hand rather than using work as a crutch to forget that conversation or that argument. Similarly, when you find yourself really in the flow state, you're just killing it, you've got a great attitude, great mood, you're getting lots of work done. Was there anything that prompted that? Was there anything that triggered that? Perhaps it was that you went to the gym before you sat down at your desk. Maybe you should do that more often. Perhaps you had an amazing conversation before you sat down at your desk. Perhaps you can try and do that. One thing I like to do is, or one thing that I've observed is that whenever I have a podcast interview early in the morning before I kick off with my actual workday, I bring a much greater sense of presence and energy to my work because those deep conversations really get me going. So there are 5 things you can do to counteract those internal triggers. So they were: 1, embrace one thing at a time away from your desk; 2, meditate; 3, breathe; 4, journal; and 5, notice. Now, on the other side of the coin, we want to talk about those external triggers. Emails coming through, notifications on your screen, on your phone. Simple. Turn off notifications, at least for a few hours a day when you're trying to get into deep work. Because otherwise, you're going to be at the mercy of Slack, of Microsoft Teams, of your inbox, of WhatsApp, of Facebook Messenger, of Instagram, of LinkedIn, of Twitter, and so on, and so on, and so on. And those tools, they all want to increase engagement. It's one of their metrics. So they're going to try and pull you back into those platforms as often as possible. And that usually comes at the expense of your ability to get into flow and do great work. So do yourself a favor and turn off those notifications. I promise you the world will not end if you turn off those notifications for a few hours. In fact, you might find a doorway to a new world because perhaps for so long you've been distracted and these devices came into our lives. We weren't ready for them. We all just opted into these notifications, and we have essentially we've kind of left the door open to our mental real estate, to these big tech companies. And, we're very conscious, or at least we should be conscious about what we put into our bodies, the food we eat, what we drink, and so on. But we should be as conscious about what we put into our minds, about our mental diet. The mental real estate we have is precious. And as Zig Ziglar, the late motivational speaker, said, you are who you are based on what goes into your mind, and you can change who you are based on changing what goes into your mind. Now, outside of that, there are other tools you might want to experiment with to help you, such as BlockSite, which kind of helps, with both internal and external triggers, but essentially it just means adding a number of websites, distraction sites to BlockSite, and so that if you find yourself going over to or navigating to those websites, the site will be blocked, essentially. You can use the Freedom app as well to do that, both on your desktop and on your phone. There's a plugin for Gmail called Inbox Pause. Now, there may be a similar plugin for Outlook and other clients, but essentially that pauses your inbox for several hours a day so that if I go into my inbox at 10 a.m., well, I won't see any new emails, say, until 1 p.m. or whatever time I set. The other thing you might want to do, there are plugins out there that will open just the Compose email window. So if I need to send an email, typically what happens is I'll go into my inbox, I'll see a bunch of other emails, I'll open them, I'll reply. Half an hour later, I'll be thinking, oh, that's right, I needed to send that email. Well, plugins like Compose Email mean that I'll just see the Compose Email window, I can send that email, won't see my inbox, won't get distracted, won't get tempted, and I can move on with the rest of my work. So these are all things you can do to get on top of those external triggers and those internal triggers to effectively help you sit there and hopefully spend 4 hours a day at least, or at least 2 hours a day. That would be an improvement on how so many people are spending their days at the moment doing deep work. Now, some of you might say, well, I am a senior leader and I don't need to be doing deep work all day long. Of course you don't. You probably got a few important meetings and whatnot, but the quality of your thinking going into those meetings, the planning, the strategic work that you do, the higher you go in an organization, well, that relies on you getting into deep work, doing your best thinking, rather than operating at a shallow level state all day, because the quality of your outcomes are a direct reflection of the quality of your decision making. So if you're making great decisions, if you're allowing yourself the ability not to be distracted, not to check your phone all day long, to actually sit there and think and process thoughts and come up with breakthrough ideas and aha moments, then that's going to transfer into the quality of your decision making. So remember, flow is critical to great work. It's where we're up to 5 times more productive, but we are incredibly distracted. And every time we switch screens, we suffer a cognitive switching penalty, and it can take us about 23 minutes to get back in the zone. And if we're checking email every 6 minutes, if we're switching screens every 20 seconds, we will find it incredibly difficult to spend any time in flow at all doing our best work. The last thing I will add to this is you can use tools like the Great Suspender to essentially pause any open browser tabs you have after a period of time. Now, the one thing I will say is try and keep those tabs to an absolute minimum. Instead of having 25 tabs open, perhaps just have one tab open based on what you're working on. Because the more tabs you have open, those tabs just being visible is a sense or is a sort of temptation for your mind. And while it's perhaps advisable to train ourselves to avoid temptation, at the same time, it does consume cognitive energy doing so. So just have that one screen open, just work on that one task at a time. And that could even be micro tasks. If I'm writing an article could be broken down into multiple tasks, such as doing the actual writing, the researching, finding hyperlinks and references and things of that persuasion. But I'd rather just do one of those at a time rather than stopping every, say, 2 paragraphs to go off and find a reference, because that's going to affect my flow. It's always advisable to do one micro task at a time. Similarly, if I'm working in social media, I'm putting together some creative, I'm researching the creative, I'm scheduling that, I'm posting that, I'm engaging with the audience, I'm looking at the analytics. But let's try and do one of those at a time for our different campaigns rather than constantly switching between these different micro tasks, which is going to just wreak havoc on our minds and just going to leave us feeling absolutely exhausted come the end of the day. So that's me riffing on task switching for the past 22 minutes. Hope you enjoyed that. Hope you got some value out of that. You can, of course, as always, learn more about my work over at steveglaveski.com. I've got a new online productivity course also available. You can find that at timerichbook.com. And that's basically it for this episode of the Workflow podcast. Hope you enjoyed that. Until next time, peace out.